Thank you. So I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Katy Taylor. Katy is an animal welfare scientist from the UK with specific expertise in the use of animals in research and teaching, and particularly regulatory testing. And we're very pleased to have Katy here to discuss the phase out of animal testing in the EU. Thank you, Katy.
Thank you very much. It's a real honour to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me to come and share my perspectives on the issue. I'll just share my screen and hang on. It's just loading. There we go. Rachel, can you see that fine?
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you.
Lovely. Okay, so I've been asked to speak to you today from a European and a US perspective in terms of what's happening in terms of the phase out of animal testing and regulatory testing. As Rachel said, I've worked on this issue for nearly 20 years now, based in the UK, but also in Europe. And so a lot of these changes that we've seen over the last sort of 20 years, I've very much been part of those changes and seen those changes happen. And it's just so nice, really, to be able to talk a lot more positively than I was 20 years ago about what's happening. I just wanted to start a little bit just to explain why it matters in terms of animal numbers, because that's very much the kind of perspective that I've come at from wanting to end animal testing from an ethical perspective, but also scientific one. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what's happening in Europe in terms of the legislation and the activity of the European agencies, US legislation and activity as well, and then just finish talking about these roadmaps, which you might have heard of. There is a lot of activity now and roadmaps towards phasing out animal testing, which is super, super exciting. So why did it matter in terms of animal numbers? When I first started working on the animal testing issue, I was quite alarmed that nobody actually really knew the scale of animal testing around the world. So in 2005, we did a big analysis of who was using which animals and how many. And then we repeated that in 2015. So these numbers are a little bit out of date, and we need to update this now because it's 2025. But I was quite surprised to see how high Australia ranks actually in terms of animal use. And I know these numbers are probably a little bit higher in more recent years, but back in 2015, and it was actually AFSA who were responsible for helping to sort of collate these numbers, because, as you know, in Australia the numbers are a bit diffuse and not collated nationally. But I was talking over 3 million animals in 2015, and the fifth largest user of animals in the world, and also my country, the UK, quite a small country, but the seventh largest user of animals. So from my perspective, not a very thing to be particularly proud of. And of course, China, Japan and US and Canada are very, very large users, and potentially these numbers are actually an underestimate. Just in terms of animal use, like what are the animals being used for? They tend to be grouped according to these fields. So you've got basic medical research, so sort of trying to understand sort of basic biological processes. That's a very, very large proportion of animal use. Translational or applied research is often very medical based, and that's doing things like drug testing, drug discovery. Regulatory testing, which we're talking about today, it is a very large proportion still, and that's the sort of testing that people think has to happen. It's often mandated in legislation or certainly made very sort of mandatory in guidance, and that's for medicines, but it could also be for cosmetics or chemical testing. So a lot of animal use is medical related. And a lot of it is regulatory. But there is positive developments on the horizon. I've just done a piece of research looking at the number of scientific publications that use non-animal based methods. and compared them to the number of publications that use animal-only based methods. And the animal-only based publications is that solid line that you can see that's fairly static at the bottom. And the line that's going upwards almost exponentially is the use of non-animal based methods in scientific publications. So we're definitely starting to see a trend now towards the use of non-animal methods, and we're almost at that tipping point, I think. So what's happening in Europe in terms of regulatory animal testing? Well, we have a piece of legislation called the Directive 2010/63, which covers the use of all animals in experiments. So no matter what they're used for, they're covered, or they're so-called protected. And that actually has full replacement as an ultimate goal. And that's been there since 2010. And we've had a very, very long-standing rule since 1986 that if a non-animal method is available, it must be used in place of an animal. Now, unfortunately, there are pieces of legislation that mandate the use of animals in testing, and they're often chemicals legislation, pesticides legislation, drug legislation. In my career, I've tended to focus on chemicals testing and also drug testing. And in Europe, we had a fairly new piece of legislation come into force in 2007 called REACH, which unfortunately mandated the use of animals to determine the safety of chemicals, including chemicals that have been in use for donkey's years. And I estimated a few years ago that probably around about 6 million animals have been used for this legislation in the last sort of 10 years or so. So bad news, but the good news is that in that legislation, it says that animal testing must be a last resort. There are mechanisms in place to try and avoid some of these animal tests, and the promotion of alternatives to animal testing is a priority. So there's some good language in the legislation. The other important piece of legislation is Directive 2001/83, which is the pharmaceutical legislation, which currently mandates the use of animals to determine the safety of drugs. That's currently being updated, and in line with what's happening in the US, it looks like wherever it used to say animal testing, it's now going to get changed to either animals / in vitro or non-clinical, which means that drug companies could potentially use non-animal methods now. There isn't a legal bar on that, because non-clinical can mean non-animal methods as well as animal methods. So that's really positive. There's quite a lot of activity being done on non-animal methods by the regulatory agencies. So these are the agencies that are in charge of these pieces of legislation. So we're dotted around Europe. So in Amsterdam now, they used to be based in London, but the European Medicines Agency, they've got a 3Rs group in place, and they've had that in place for a very long time. I actually asked them to put that in place years ago, and they did do that, and that's going really strongly, and I'll give you a bit more information about that in the next slide. In Finland, we've got the European Chemicals Agency that was set up to administer the REACH regulation. REACH is currently under revision, and we're hoping it'll be improved even further in terms of the language there. And we're hoping that the European Chemicals Agency will also set up a 3Rs group like the European Medicines Agency. In northern Italy, we've got AFSA, which is the European Food Safety Authority. So they're responsible for safety of novel foods that we might eat, or foods that animals might eat, but also in relation to food production. So that's things like pesticides. And unfortunately, there's still a requirement to test on dogs for pesticides, but they are doing a lot of activity to try and phase that out now. And they were the first agency in Europe to come up with a roadmap towards phasing out animal testing. And then also in northern Italy, we've got the European Centre for the Validation of Alternative Methods, who've been around since 1991, do a great deal of work on the promotion of non-animal methods. this is just a screenshot from their website. They do a status report every year outlining what they've done. They're always doing new initiatives. At the moment, they've got a roadmap for standardization of organ-on-a-chip technology. And they're also promoting something that's coming out of the European roadmap, which is encouraging anybody that's doing anything towards the phase out of animal tests to register their activity as what they're calling a transitional initiative. So there's lots of activity coming from ECFAM, which is great. The European Medicines Agency at the moment are leading the way in terms of the promotion of non-animal methods. Say they've had this working group in place for a long time. In their regulatory science strategy to 2025, they actually put in there that they wanted to really do a lot more in terms of replacing animal testing. And they're currently updating their guidance. We're hoping to see something that could be quite positive in terms of replacing NHPs, which stands for non-human primates. As you know, monkeys are used in drug testing, and that's now on their radar, which is great. And they have an innovation task force, which provides drug companies with an opportunity to come to them early on in their drug development process to ask them, would you accept this non-animal method? And they can give them advice, which is great. We've also got in Europe something called the European Partnership for the Alternative Approaches to Animal Testing, or EPAA, and actually it's their 20th anniversary next month. They have an annual conference every year in November, and this one's coming up, and it's usually streamed online, so I would encourage you to check that link to see if you can watch it online, and they'll be updating everybody on what they've been doing. It's really a tremendous initiative. It's the European Commission, together with pharmaceutical companies and chemical companies, working together to try to replace animal testing, and they break it down into the specific animal tests that are commonly used, and they've been very influential in areas such as skin sensitization tests on guinea pigs and mice, pyrogen tests that use rabbits. And all these tests are now being gradually phased out, which is great. So in the US, also actually quite a positive picture, and that's happened a lot more recently. But there's really a lot of positive developments in the US. Their Animal Welfare Act is sort of the equivalent to the directive that we have in Europe, but it is a bit rubbish. It covers the use of some animals in experiments, but not all animals. So as you might know, unfortunately, birds and mice and rats and fish are not covered by that piece of legislation particularly, and they're certainly not counted in their statistics, which is a huge amount of animal testing, which is a shame. But more recently, the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is their chemical safety legislation, so their equivalent to REACH in the EU, that was updated in 2016. And in that legislation, it tasked the agency to come up with a strategic plan to promote the use of non-animal methods, which they did do. And that was supported by, at the time, the administrator of the EPA, to say that they wanted to end all mammalian-based chemical testing by 2035. They've rode back on that a little bit because that was possibly a little bit ambitious, but they're certainly still doing a lot of activity to try and make that happen. And I've just included a link there for you that hopefully you can see when this goes onto YouTube. You'll have a bit more time to be able to grab that link and take a look. The pharmaceutical legislation is the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetics Act, and as everybody knows, that's administered by the Food and Drug Administration. So they cover food, drugs and cosmetics all in one go. And in 2017, the FDA were the first agency to actually publish a roadmap towards the promotion of non-animal methods, certainly with a view to reducing and phasing out animal testing, which is great. And in 2020, they set up an alternative methods working group, so kind of like the equivalent to the 3Rs group that we've got in Europe. And then the legislation was actually updated really recently, and so they're ahead of the game in terms of Europe, because they've already deleted the word animal every time it's mentioned in terms of sort of animal testing and animal testing requirements, and they've replaced it with the word non-clinical, which, as I said before, that opens the door for companies to be able to use non-animal methods. They don't have to use an animal, which is amazing. So the FDA are leading the way there. And similar to the Innovation Task Force, this is their program, which allows companies to come forward with new ideas for how they could test drugs without using animals, and talk to the FDA about how suitable they might be, and get some feedback. The NIH is the big funding body in the US, which is the equivalent of the Australian National Health and Research Council that you've got. And again, although they've traditionally been big supporters of animal research and big funders of animal research, particularly primate research, things are really starting to change. They have ICFAM, which is the equivalent of ECFAM that we have in Europe, and that's been going for a long time, and that coordinates the validation of alternative methods. They've got a lot of activity, and for years they were kind of acting on their own, but now the NIH is really stepping up, and they've now got what's called the complementary program for funding non-animal methods, specifically with a view to really getting rid of animal testing. And so there's a big funding stream now available for that. They've also just announced a dedicated centre for the development of organoids, which are a very exciting non-animal method. And that came at the same time as an amazing announcement that they would no longer fund animal-only based research. They will still fund animal research, but the researchers have to demonstrate that they're also trying to use non-animal methods. So that's a huge step forward. And just to finish off, just wanted to talk about these roadmaps that we've now got. There's around about 20 floating around the world. They're largely coming from North America and Europe, and they come in various forms, but their general aim is a strategy for how either an agency or a country might move away from animal testing and moving more towards the use of non-animal. That was the first one to come out, and they've now got a new one that's come out this year. The EPA have their ones. There's a few of those, the NIH, ICFAM, and Canada just announced one as well. And in Europe, until recently, that was just led sort of nationally. So the Netherlands are a big leader in the use of non-animal methods. They've got a few roadmaps. The UK did one a few years ago, and we're actually expecting hopefully much more sort of progressive ones come out and any point now, sort of by the end of this year. Norway have one, and the European Food Safety Agency, of course, have got one as well. So I just go through what this latest FDA roadmap says. It's a pretty good roadmap. I'm actually doing a project at the moment looking at all these roadmaps and evaluating them and comparing them and see which ones are particularly strong, which ones are perhaps less strong. This one looks like it's quite a strong one. It's very honest about the failings of animal tests, and also recognising public opinion I was quite excited to hear about the opinion poll that you've just done. That's amazing. And they're also pretty clear about what their plans are. So in the long term, which isn't really such a long term, really 3 to 5 years, they'll aim to make animal studies the exception rather than the norm. And the roadmap itself is only starting with a certain type of drug. They're going to try and phase out animal testing for monoclonal antibody-based drugs because actually they're extremely human specific, and the animal models just don't work anyway. And they've got 6 short-term and 6 long-term actions that they promised to do. So I mean, that's great. It's great to have that commitment and actually a proper plan in place. So in Europe, we've got a roadmap that's coming, and I've been quite involved in this as a stakeholder, as an animal welfare stakeholder. It came out as a result of basically a huge petition. There was one a few years previously called Stop Vivisection, which is a lot more general, and the European Commission's response to that was a little bit disappointing. So we organised another one. That was a lot more focused, particularly on the cosmetics issue, because unfortunately, cosmetics are still being tested on animals because some cosmetics ingredients are technically chemicals. And as I said, under that REACH legislation, they have to be animal tested, which is undermining the cosmetics testing ban that we've had in place in Europe for a while and that we're all very proud of. So there was another petition. We reached the target of more than 1 million signatures, which means that the European Commission have to respond. How they respond is entirely up to them. But this time they did respond a lot more positively, and they said, OK, we'll draft a roadmap for how we will phase out animal testing of chemicals. But under chemicals, they also included pharmaceuticals, which is good. So they started work on this roadmap, and it's been a very sort of open process. Stakeholders have been involved all the way. There's been various consultations. There's been 3 workshops. There's 3 working groups. There's the working group looking at animal testing for human health, animal testing for environmental safety, and a working group on change management, because there's certainly a feeling that it's more than just science here. You know, you need to change hearts and minds, and the way that scientists approach this problem is a lot more of a sociological and a philosophical challenge as well as a scientific one. And we've had animal welfare stakeholders in these 3 groups. And it looks like they might come up with some options for short-term actions, mid-term and long-term actions, which is good. They're also very much got an eye to the long term, and the sort of feeling in Europe is that toxicology really needs to change really quite dramatically in order to be able to replace animal tests, because it's very hard to replace an animal test like for like now with just one non-animal method. You're going to probably need several non-animal methods to replace a single animal test now. So they're aware of this sort of long-term challenge, and hopefully there'll be some recommendations for how they approach that there. So we're hoping to see some concrete action points like we've seen in the FDA one, milestones and indicators. And I'm also quite excited that they're going to hopefully suggest some changes to organisational structures. So we might see an actual roadmap committee that will take this roadmap forward, so that it's not just a document that sits there. There will actually be a group of people that continue to work to make this phase out happen. So I'm aware that I've rattled through a huge amount of information for you. Hopefully you can perhaps go back and have another look at it. But just in summary, as I say, very nice to be able to give a positive presentation. We've got removal of mandated animal tests in place in parts of the US, or it's in progress in Europe. We've got agencies in Europe and the US that have now actually taken up the responsibility to reduce animal testing, whether that's in their strategies, whether they've got a 3 Rs working group, whether it's actually in the legislation. And we're now starting to see these roadmaps towards animal-free testing. Some are already in place and being worked through, particularly in the US, but we've got some that are in progress, and we'll hope to see end of this year or early next year from the EU and also the UK. So all positive stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katy. If anyone's got any questions, please add them to the Q&A, and we will have a Q&A at the end. And I would now like to introduce our second speaker, who will focus on the Australian regulatory landscapes, Natalie Anderson. Natalie is the Regulatory Science Officer at AFSA and participates as part of the International Council on Animal Protection and OECD programs, and engages with government, academia, and industry stakeholders to advance non-animal models uptake. So over to you, Natalie.
Awesome. Just checking, Rachel, you can see my PowerPoint slides?
Yes.
Yep. Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Katy, for an incredible talk and overview of the international developments, and hopefully this evening I'll be able to take you through some of what Australia is doing in response to all of these fantastic developments we're seeing overseas. So, yeah, today I will going to minimize that one. Today I will talk you through the Australian perspective on the acceptance of non-animal models, some of our therapeutic goods administration alternate approval pathways that have recently been announced, and some of the continued recommendations that AFSA have for the Australian TGA as to how we can progress things in Australia based on those international developments. And yeah, I would also like to acknowledge the Noongar Whadjuk people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm meeting or presenting from today in Perth in Western Australia. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the audience today. So my role at AFSA is to engage with industry and regulatory stakeholders to advocate for policy change or implementation of non-animal models into regulatory guidelines, to represent AFSA within the International Council on Animal Protection and Pharmaceutical Programs, and to maintain the accuracy of AFSA information and content on our regulatory affairs globally. So hopefully some of that is being achieved through this webinar as well today. Some of the as this is a supporters webinar, I just wanted to give a little overview of some of the advocacy that we have been doing in the regulatory space, which we sort of began since 2023, and we'll go into why sort of everything kicked off around then in Australia shortly. But we presented at the national sort of life sciences, or the biggest life sciences conference in Australia called AusBiotech, and that was the first session that had been held on non-animal models in Australia, really, sort of in a formal capacity, where industry and regulatory stakeholders were present. We requested to the Therapeutic Goods Administration for examples of non-animal models being used. And so I'm going backwards through these, actually, I realised, and we got examples from that were as early as 2023, I believe. We requested that specific international guidelines be adopted, which would allow the TGA to or Australian sponsors to utilise those international guidelines. And there was, I think, we'll look at those in detail later, but there's a list of about 6 or 7, I believe. We have written to the TGA requesting information and how we can collaborate. We have again requested guidelines be adopted, and that occurred earlier this year. We presented at the Association for Regulatory and Clinical Scientists to the Australian Pharmaceutical Industry, or ARCS, at their regulatory webinar earlier this year. And we have planned, again, sending a letter to the TGA and attending AusBiotech, again, for networking this year. So our regulatory interest through the International Council on Animal Protection and Pharmaceutical Programs began in 2024 when AFSA became an organisational member of ICAP. We also contributed in 2024 and 2025 to commentary on the guidelines on the phasing out of animal tests for the quality control of biological products. And the organisations that you can see on screen form part of the International Council on Animal Protection and Pharmaceutical Programs. So AFSA are just one of these organisations globally. Just to give a little bit of background as to why we need animal-free science here in Australia, you may already be aware that all use of animals for scientific purposes in Australia comes with scientific and ethical responsibility under the Australian Code for the Care and Use of Animals for Scientific Purposes. This was released in 2013 and had some very minor updates made to it in 2021 to accommodate the changes to testing for cosmetics purposes. Essentially, there are two types of scientific licenses in Australia. There's either to use animals for scientific purposes or to supply animals for scientific purposes. And all license holders in Australia have a duty to uphold the conditions of the code, and the code is implemented in various state and territory legislations and in various institutional policies as well, university or research institute, for example. The good news is, although that the Australian Code is quite old, it is up for review. So we know that that is going to be up for review around mid-2026, and AFSA will be involved in making submissions and advocating for these changes in the code, because this is a really important opportunity to make changes for animals used in science research and education, and to have their voice heard, as this code is really central to most things that most use of animals, or all use of animals in Australia. It's important to acknowledge, though, that animal use is not mandated for safety and efficacy testing for pharmaceutical products. It's not mandated in the code or in legislation in Australia. And yeah, just reiterating that, given that we have a strong focus in Australia, that research must be able to be implemented in practice, and it must translate to some sort of output or outcome for the Australian public. So therefore, it is critical that the code acknowledges that there is a transition away from animal testing in the US and in the EU, and especially with that European Commission roadmap that Katy mentioned, that's due to launch in 2026. So why do we need animal-free safety testing? Katy already touched on that there's a really high failure rate. So 90 to 99% of drugs that are tested in preclinical animal trials fail due to safety or efficacy when they go through to human clinical trials. So clearly, we've known for quite some time that that we're doing something wrong there. And we also know now that non-animal models and technologies are actually better science, and some animal testing or animal tests for regulatory purposes were actually adopted prior to quality control guidelines. So that means that they were never validated, essentially. There's then again a cost benefit and a time savings to all these non-animal models and methods, and they have the potential to provide better protection for human health, as the non-animal models and methods tend to cover more endpoints that have clinical relevance or biological relevance to humans. So that's how they can essentially provide better protection. In the long term, if we're using these non-animal models and methods, drugs will be cheaper if the companies do pass on those cost savings, and there will be a quicker time to market, which is beneficial for patients. Also, companies can use these non-animal models to make more informed go and no-go decisions for a particular drug, and they already are doing this as well. So just to put Australia in perspective of the global pharmaceutical market, the US is the major proportion of the market, approximately 55% and 67% of sales. Europe is the next largest, including France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK, and accounting for 22.7% and roughly 16% of sales. Then there's the rest of the world, and Australia is included in this. Japan at roughly 4.5%. And so Australia accounts for a very small percent of the global pharmaceutical market. However, in 2023, we saw CSIRO non-animal model strategy for Australia, a strategy for maturing Australia's medical product development capabilities. And CSIRO recommended that Australia align with the US FDA. So that was all of the new developments that Katy was talking about with the roadmap, etc. And that if we did align with the US and take on the other recommendations that were in this report, and utilize non-animal models and methods, specifically two methods, one called organ on a chip and one called organoids. If we specifically started utilizing these methods, it could bring 1.6 billion to the Australian economy. So there's a big economic benefit to doing this. However, historically, the Therapeutic Goods Administration here has aligned more with the European Medicines Agency than with the US FDA. And so that's why when that roadmap comes in early next year, that will be a really critical time for Australia to make some decisions as to which roadmaps we might be aligning with. This report is more of a recommendation. It's not specifically a roadmap. It's just more about the economic benefit that Australia could have by taking on and utilising these models and methods in drug development more. We do have mutual recognition agreements with the EU and a cooperative agreement with the US. So taking on and aligning with any of these roadmaps is definitely within the capability that the TGA has given these agreements. Just briefly to outline the investment, as sometimes this is an indicator of where we may be headed, and we've seen already Katy outlined the developments in the EU and the US, and there has been a considerable investment. AFSA presented or released a business case earlier this year outlining this investment, so approximately 1.3 to 1.4 billion in the EU and the US, whereas comparatively Australia is 7.5 million in investment. So we're very much smaller investment, but also, like we just saw, we are a much smaller proportion of the global pharmaceutical market as well. So I briefly mentioned earlier, animal testing is not mandated in Australian legislation, so it's not in the Therapeutic Goods Act 1989, but animal testing is implied in AU legislation because we have a requirement for guideline M4, a legislative requirement for guideline M4, which is a safety guidance that sets a legislative requirement for mandatory requirements for an effective application. So essentially, we do mandate animal testing through this guidance. the TGA do often adopt EMA or European Medicines Agency guidelines, and they are a member country of the International Medicines Regulators Working Group on the 3 Rs. So we do expect to see some progress since they have joined that. And we just previously saw CSIRO recommended that TGA align with the FDA to advance non-animal models. And so just a couple of months ago, there was a workshop, US National Institutes of Health, US FDA workshop, that the TGA did a short presentation right at the end of, and they announced some alternate regulatory approval pathways. So we'll look at those in the next slide, I believe. But we also, in Australia, we have the Non-Animal Technology Network, which is based in New South Wales. And they have a regulatory pillar. And through that regulatory pillar, they engage with all national regulators, including the TGA. Sorry, just before we go through the approval pathways, I just wanted to quickly show you that these are some of the guidelines that were adopted by TGA in 2024, which AFSA requested, and all of these guidelines the International Council on Animal Protection in Pharmaceutical Programs believe can reduce the use of animals or increase the uptake of replacements to animal testing. And you can read more about this on, we have an opinion post on progress in Australia in 2024. So these alternate approval pathways, what do they look like? Well, essentially, none of these pathways are new, but the TGA are implying or suggesting that we can leverage these existing pathways as alternate approval pathway types for non-animal models. So they include variations for an existing medicine, using literature-based submissions, using the comparable overseas regulatory evaluation pathway, accepting non-animal model based studies within a non-clinical data set. So maybe just replacing 1 or 2 specific types of required safety testing in animals with a non-clinical in vitro or cell-based non-animal test or a computational based test, or ICH guidance, this is International Council on Harmonisation guidance, where that indicates non-clinical studies are not required. And then finally, I just want to end with our key recommendations for Australian regulators. So we, when the US announced their roadmap, we did a media release. You can find that on our website. We recommended that Australia join the International Cooperation on Alternate Test Methods, that we apply the CSIRO Futures recommendations for the non-animal model strategy, including align with the FDA. We established an equivalent of the ICVAM in the EU or another relevant scientific advisory committee, that we create the equivalent of the EU Innovation Task Force or the Innovative Science Innovative Science and Technology Approaches for New Drugs, or ISAN program in the US, both of those that Katy mentioned, and that we importantly allocate federal budget to non-animal models, continue funding for the Non-Animal Technology Network to expand that to national level. And yeah, so those were our primary recommendations. You can read more in our media release. Just threw this one in at the end just to show you that investors in Australia are really wanting to avoid animal-related issues when investing, and 66% of those investors cite animal cruelty as the most important to avoid, even higher than human rights and environmental issues, and 54% want to avoid animal testing for non-medical purposes when they invest as well, so for cosmetics, etc. So where I've going to be over time, but thank you everyone for helping, everyone that's joining us in the audience today. Thank you for helping us to work towards our vision here at AFSA, where there is a future where no animals are harmed in the name of science, and scientific progress is advanced through animal-free research methods. And you're always welcome to reach me on email or follow me, connect with me on LinkedIn, and certainly with our web pages and our newsletters as well. So I will hand over just finally, this is our webpage. Most of the information that I presented here today you can find on our Regulation of Human Medicines webpage, and the TGA gave specific examples of drugs that have been approved through all of those alternate regulatory approval pathways that I mentioned. So you can see those all listed as examples on this webpage here as well. So yeah, I think that was all, and I'll stop sharing and hand over for question time.
Thank you very much, Natalie. With that, we'll just end the formal recording.
Yep.
And I will just see if there's any questions in the Q&A. And if you haven't got to put your question in yet, then